Hi, everyone. Today we have two fantastic stories for you. We start off at the border of Pennsylvania and Delaware, where we hear from a listener who encounters the most shocking thing they've ever seen in their life. And then we hear from a police officer in Connecticut who describes for us something unexplainable that he encountered on the job. So if you're cozied up and enjoying listening, please subscribe and turn on all notifications so we can do this again soon. Great. Now let's get into the stories. Hey, Lilith. I've listened to your channel for a while now, and I've met most of your stories with a mix of skepticism and awe. It's hard to believe that so many mystical creatures and beings exist in the world, and I thought that maybe some people were exaggerating or even straight up lying. Well, I no longer believe that. After hearing so many stories, I felt inspired to try to hunt down one of these things myself. I grew up in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, which is right on the border of Pennsylvania and Delaware. There's a state park close by, Brandywine State Park, where the famous battle was fought. A small part of that park is known as Beaver Valley. From satanic cults to a town full of little people, the number of conspiracies surrounding the place can lead you down quite a rabbit hole. I've been there in the daytime once or twice. Some people used it as a shortcut when Naaman's Road was backed up, but never at night and never on any of the roads that supposedly harbored evil spirits. Well, one night after getting out of work around 11 o'clock but feeling adventurous, I called my friend Alan to see if he wanted to check the place out with me. He agreed, and within a half hour I had picked him up and we were on our way. The park itself is pretty big, and there are multiple roads leading into and out of it. Navigating it can be a little confusing, and cell phone service stinks down there, so GPS apps don't always work. Alan said he knew his way around, but I didn't really believe him. It didn't matter. I didn't have anything else to do this late at night anyway. So driving through the outskirts of the park was a little creepy. A few people live back in there, but there's no streetlights at all. The only illumination we had was being cast by my car's headlights. The roads rose and fell and curved often, sometimes sharply, so I had to give driving my full attention. Eventually, we found what we were looking for, Satan's Road, so called because of the way that the trees grow along the road. They all curve away from the road as if they're trying to uproot and escape something that's coming from deeper within the forest. I've heard about it plenty of times, but actually seeing it, well, that's a very different experience. There are rumors of cults practicing satanic rituals here in the wood. Recalling the rumors and seeing the trees, I was starting to feel like I had my fill of weirdness for the night. I was thinking about getting through as fast as I could and getting back out onto one of the larger roads when Alan gave a surprised yelp from the passenger seat. He told me that he was looking in the forest beside the car, and he had seen something running along before disappearing into the brush. He didn't know what it was, but he said it could have been a deer or something. There's a lot of them back there. I hoped so, and I kept driving. I figured out we were 3/4 of the way through when I rounded another sharp curve, and I had to slam on my brakes. I had almost hit it. Right in front of the car, about 10 feet away, shining in the headlights, stood a completely naked man. Now, it was January, and the temperatures have been dropping into the 30s lately, so the guy should have been freezing. A tall, thin man, filthy with long, matted brown hair and an unkempt beard, stood staring into the windshield, not shivering or showing any signs of being exposed to the cold. And his breath wasn't even fogging. Alan and I sat silently, both too shocked to say anything, and honestly, I was extremely scared. It started to get colder, and even inside the car I started to shiver, and then a moment later was shivering uncontrollably. Alan was doing the same right next to me. I began coming around to what was happening, and I reached down to put the car in reverse. Something was telling me to just get the hell out of there and leave the naked guy standing in the road. But the car would not move. I was pressing the gas and the engine wouldn't even rev. I wasn't even sure that the car was on anymore. Now my head was beginning to feel foggy. Thoughts and ideas kept forming in my head, but they were slipping away before they could take root. I vaguely remember Alan next to me reciting something that sounded like a Bible verse. As far as I know, Alan isn't particularly religious, and I found it strange that he could quote passages from the Bible. And then the man started to move, slowly stepping backward, methodically, foot after foot, still staring right into the windshield at me and Alan. The man backed away completely out of view of the headlights, and then all that was in front of us was a stretch of empty road. I started warming up immediately, and the fogginess began drifting away. And then I saw the eyes. Ahead on the road, coming from where the man had disappeared, was this pair of narrowed red orbs, hovering about 8 feet off the ground. They were moving slowly up and down as if attached to something moving. They were. The creature slowly appeared in view of the light. It had the shape and size of a horse, but the head was a sick cross between a ram and a man. Curling horns jutted from both sides and wisps of dark fur, but the nose and the mouth were unmistakably human. The fogginess returned tenfold, and I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I woke up to banging on my window next to my head, and I had an excruciating headache, and there was a light being shined in my face. It was a police officer. In short, we had come to in a small clearing off the roundabout about 3 miles away from where we had been. Alan had passed out as well, and neither of us could recall anything. The police officer asked us a lot of questions and even searched the car for drugs and gave me a breathalyzer. We told him everything, and by the time we were done, he must have just thought we were some kind of weird loonies, and he just wanted to get rid of us. We hadn't really done anything illegal, at least I didn't think so he let us go. I don't know how we ended up in the clearing, and I don't remember what happened after we saw the thing. I mean, bits and pieces are coming back to me slowly. I'm trying to think of all kinds of excuses. Maybe something was up with my car and we got a non-lethal dose of carbon monoxide or something. I don't know. I can't explain it. Since that night, there are random moments where I feel a sense of overwhelming terror, like something horrible is only seconds away from happening. And for some reason, the date of August 17th, 2026 is constantly on my mind. I can't get it out of my head, and I have no idea why. Every cop has their share of crazy stories, but this one is definitely the highlight of my career. Back in the 80s, I was an officer in the Bridgeport Police Department. It's an industrial center on the coast of Connecticut. It's not a massive metroplex like Dallas or New York City, but it's big enough to have its share of crime. I worked in the North End, up toward the border with Trumbull in a residential area. Lots of duplexes and triplexes there, so there were more families than you would think based on the housing. The thing about being a neighborhood cop is that at least back then, we got to know the people. There was always somebody good to give you gossip and a lot of time. That kind of connection helps you keep the peace better than anything the force tells you to do nowadays. My favorite neighbor, actually she was everybody's favorite neighbor, was Mrs. Belinsky. She was a sweet elderly woman in her 80s who owned a triplex in the middle of the block. She didn't have family close by, so everybody looked out for her. Mrs. Belinsky baked the best cookies, which she always had ready for me on Tuesday when I stopped by. She would smile and chat, and I'd make sure she didn't need anything before I kept going on my patrol. Fortunately, she lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so there weren't many problems. Sure, there was the occasional drunk neighbor, especially on Saturday nights, or maybe there was a loud party every once in a while, but I never got a call to go to Mrs. Belinsky's place. Until the night I did. The call didn't come from her, it came from a neighbor. Like I said, everybody loved Mrs. Belinsky and made sure that they looked out for her. So when the neighbor lady heard loud arguing coming from the Belinsky house, she called the station. I hadn't clocked out yet, so I came over as fast as I could to do a welfare check. I went in the rattling gate and I knocked on the door. I knew it would take Mrs. Belinsky a while to get to the door, so I made sure I listened for any raised voices, since that's what the neighbor's complaint said. When Mrs. Belinsky finally got to the door, she was in her housecoat and carrying her little white poodle. She didn't seem to be in distress, but the dog looked a little agitated. Still, Mrs. Belinsky was surprised to see me. Apparently, she hadn't heard anything. She didn't have tenants at the moment, so she couldn't imagine why her neighbor would say she had heard yelling. Since she wasn't in danger and I couldn't hear anything, I asked if I could make a perimeter check of her property to make sure that everything was closed up tight. She didn't have a problem with that, so I walked around, tapping the windows to make sure none of them were loose and checking the door locks. The front of the house was fine, but the big backyard was overgrown in some spots, and that made me nervous. It was dark and the yard had some bushes that would make great cover for anybody trying to sneak around. I didn't see any signs that anybody had been there, but there was something about the yard that just made my skin crawl. Still, I didn't see any intruders or sign of trespassers, so I had to report to Mrs. Belinsky that everything was fine. I told her to call if she heard anything, and then I left. Everything seemed to go back to normal. I checked in with the neighbor who had made the initial report, but she hadn't heard anything further. I asked casually if she had seen anything or anybody in the backyard. Turns out her teenage son mowed Mrs. Belinsky's lawn for her, but he never said he saw anything. I chalked it up to a loud TV. Mrs. Belinsky was half deaf, and I considered the matter closed. Until the next Tuesday night, when a different neighbor called the precinct to report what sounded like a man yelling at Mrs. Belinsky's house. I sped over there, lights and sirens, jerked open the gate, and sprinted up the steps. As I pounded on the storm door, the yelling cut off like somebody had yanked the plug on it. The hair on the back of my neck was already standing up, and the feeling only got worse as I waited for Mrs. Belinsky to come to the door. When she didn't, well, you don't have to be a cop to realize what was going through my head. By now, some of the neighbors were standing around, hanging at the fence line. I pounded on the door one more time and announced that I was the police. Still, nothing. I could hear sirens in the distance and I knew backup was coming, but I didn't want to wait. Not with the life of one elderly lady potentially hanging in the balance. So I kicked open the door and I went in. I knew the layout of Mrs. Belinsky's first floor since I had been there. The front room parlor, where she had all of her best furniture, was empty. And then the doorway opposite me led to the dining room and then the kitchen. I knew she watched her shows in her little sitting room off of the dining room. If she was doing her usual thing and just hadn't heard me, I knew that that's where she would be. I was listening for any sounds at all. But other than the sounds of the street outside, I didn't hear anything. I moved left, gun drawn, and I held low and ready, and I eased around the corner to peek into the sitting room. Mrs. B was in her rocking chair, either asleep or unconscious. She didn't appear to be injured, and there were no other signs of an intruder, but that didn't mean I relaxed. Her dog was missing. I holstered my service weapon and I tried to wake Mrs. Belinsky. To say she was surprised to see me was an understatement. Once I explained what had happened, I asked where the poodle was. She said she didn't know. That bad feeling had never really left, but now it came back with a vengeance. I got Mrs. B outside with the neighbors and I promised to look for her dog. I figured if the poodle wasn't with her owner, it probably wasn't on the first floor. So I went through the door that led to the second floor apartment. The layout up there was similar to Mrs. Belinsky's, with a hallway leading to the third floor stair in the back. Mrs. Belinsky's apartment was homey and old-fashioned. These untenanted floors were unsettling, to say the least. Weird. The floors creaked under my weight, but the further into the space I went, the more muffled the sound seemed to be. It almost felt like I was underwater. Everything seemed to come to me slowly. Sound, thoughts, everything. The space was strange, but it was also empty. I headed for the stairway to the last apartment, and as soon as my shoe touched the steep painted stair, I heard yelling. I couldn't make out what was being said, but there was a very clear argument happening. Male and female voices. My training kicked in. I started up the stairs with my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew there were 10 stairs, I knew because I counted them. But even though I knew that, I felt like I was climbing them forever. It was like the minutes were being stretched out like taffy by hands that I couldn't see, and for a reason that I didn't understand. Finally, I broke all my training and I looked down at each step as I took it, mentally walking myself through the motions of picking up my foot, placing my foot on the next step. Now my foot is on this step. I'm moving up. I know it sounds utterly ridiculous now that I'm writing it, but at the time, it was the only way I could seem to get up there at all. And then I got to the third floor landing, and the door to the next apartment was right there. I could hear the argument again, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I felt like I was hearing everything underwater. I'm ashamed to say this, but I actually broke out in goosebumps. I mean, I wasn't a rookie, and this wasn't my first domestic disturbance call, but I also knew that there shouldn't be anybody in that apartment to even have a disturbance. I took a deep breath and I pounded on the door. Police! I don't have an explanation for what happened next, so I'll just report it. The landing got cold. There was a breeze cold. Frigid. So cold that I could see my breath puffing out, fast and uneven. The landing light came on even though I wasn't anywhere near the switch, and that somehow made the shadows at the edges of the landing even darker. At that point, all I wanted to do was to leave, but I couldn't make myself move. I have no idea what I would have done if I hadn't heard a whimper. I almost jumped out of my skin when something touched my leg. It was Mrs. Belinsky's little white dog, shivering so hard that it looked like it was going to shake itself into pieces. I don't know what it was about the dog, but just having it there, knowing I needed to get it back to Mrs. B, who loved it, made me able to move. I scooped up the dog and I started hustling back down the stairs. I was terrified that it would take just as long to get down them as it had seemed to get up them, but I felt like I was able to move normally. I didn't breathe right until I got down to Mrs. Belinsky's floor. As soon as the poodle saw her, it squirmed out of my hold and trotted right over to her, who was sitting with a couple of neighbors. The cold feeling then vanished, and I was left feeling almost silly for being worried. Almost. I don't quite remember how I ended up filling out the incident report on that call, but I'm pretty sure I didn't mention cold spots, odd time distortions, and an argument from people who didn't exist. As for Mrs. Belinsky's noise problem, well, her neighbors talked her into having her parish priest come over, and I guess that blessing the house did the trick, or at least I was never called back there for that kind of a disturbance again.